Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Brexit is a reality and the UK is finally out of the European Union. Now what? What kind of relationship will the UK have with Europe and the US? Also, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo asks, do you think Americans care about Ukraine? Cross-talking some real news. I'm joined by my guest here in Moscow, Dmitry Babich. He's a political analyst and editor at InnoSme Internet Media Project. And in London, we cross to Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Let me go to Marcus first in London. Well, it took 1,316 days, but the UK is finally out of the European Union. The next 11 months will be very key. What can we expect? And I want to focus on geopolitics here. What kind of balancing acts does Prime Minister Boris Johnson have to play in dealing with a new relationship with the European Union and possibly a new relationship with the United States? Go ahead, Marcus.
Well, now that Britain has left the European Union, the hard work begins. Because whilst on the one hand, Brexit offers opportunities to the UK, for example, for courts in Britain to regain their supremacy and for Britain to construct a sensible and coherent immigration policy. On the other hand, there are challenges to the UK. And one of those challenges for Britain is to secure both long-term and advantageous trade deals with countries around the world. And there are question marks as to whether Britain can secure advantageous trade deals with countries. So, for example, when it comes to America, there is some concern that, yes, Britain will be able to secure a trade deal with America, but just how advantageous will that trade deal be?
Okay, well, Marcus, so the two words come to mind, Trojan horse. That's what a lot of people are worried about, is that the UK will be, Johnson will be so keen to get a trade agreement with the United States that it may not be as advantageous as it should be, and the true spirit of what Brexit was all about. Keep going.
Yes, absolutely. And in particular, what sort of access will the Americans have to Britain's National Health Service? And let me tell you this very short story, Peter. Recently, I was speaking with an Australian official, and this official told me that while Australia would be open to signing a new trade deal with Britain, Australians view a reinvigorated Britain in Southeast Asia as a rival to Australia, because, of course, naturally, Australia has a lot of economic interests and investments in Southeast Asia. So when we hear British politicians and journalists say that Australia is at the front of the queue, our brothers and sisters in Australia want to sign a new trade deal, that's not giving the full picture. And I also believe that the world will witness a coming together, a strengthening of the Anglo-Saxon world, by which I mean Britain, America, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia.
The Five
and
Eyes.
therein lie a threat to the world. And within a few hours of Britain having left the European Union, Peter, Canada had proposed a non-political union involving Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. So I believe that the Anglo-Saxon world, which in the last quarter of a century at least has been responsible for so much carnage and destruction around the world, could actually be strengthened as a result of Brexit.
That's very interesting. I haven't heard that. That is very new. Dima, but you know, you have to, before you have a new relationship, you have to end the past one. And unraveling the relationship with the EU is going to take a lot of time. 11 months isn't that much time. Big trade agreements usually take years. So we're going to have to, you know, condense this down right here. The issue is also in foreign policy, and I'm glad Marcus brought that up, is that the UK has usually gone along with a lot of the European countries, the continental countries, when it comes to foreign policy. Now, that could be unhinged here. I'm thinking in terms of like Iran, for example. And Tony Blair famously said when he was deciding to go along with George W. Bush in invading Iraq, is that he thought historically that Britain must always choose the U.S. over Europe. Is that the same question that Boris Johnson's going to have to face?
Well, talking about the reasons why that happened, when a child leaves a school, probably the problem is with the child, but even more often the problem is with the school. And you don't hear it that much, in the international press now. What was wrong with Europe,
Yeah.
What was wrong with the European Union? Everyone is just concentrated on these arguments between Boris Johnson and his opponents. And why has Europe become so unattractive? Well, I think the answer is very simple. It ceased to be a peaceful continent. People repeat, the zone of prosperity and stability. Well, this zone of prosperity and stability participated in the war in Afghanistan, in the war in Iraq. It continues to participate in Afghanistan, in the destruction of Yugoslavia. In unleashing the civil war in Ukraine, the EU played even bigger role than the United States. So I agree with Marcus when he speaks about carnage. But that carnage was inflicted not only by the Anglo-Saxons, but by this whole ideology of which the Anglo-Saxon countries unfortunately were a part. This radical ideology to remake the world in the image of the West, So basically, I'm afraid that even though we may have more conflict between Britain and Europe, between the United States and the EU, that all doesn't mean that all of this ideology will stop to be aggressive. Communist China had conflicts with communist Soviet Union. It didn't mean that
communist
that was
Vietnam as well. Also.
Exactly.
Marcus, take us through this here, because the European Union, Brexit is important in a very metaphorical sense. It is a precedent that has been established here. What is Europe going to do? Is it going to double down, or is it going to have a post-mortem and trying to explain and understand why Brexit happened in the first place? Because once the precedent is set, others can follow and actually develop a strategy looking at the British example of how to do it and do it right, and probably do it with less pain and quicker. Is this something Brussels is thinking about? And if they're not, should they be? Go ahead.
Well, shortly after Britain left the European Union, there were officials in Brussels who were speaking openly about Europe, about the European Union having to reform. And indeed, one EU official said that we have to learn to be loved more, because a lot of people within the European Union have fallen out of love with the EU. And I would also say this, Peter, that there are a number of politicians in Britain at Westminster who are seeking to weaken the European Union, despite the fact that Britain has left the EU. So there are some Conservative politicians who are actively encouraging Poland to try and break away from the European Union by playing the German card. So those British politicians are saying to Poland that Germany caused you so much pain, so much agony, and they never paid you the reparations caused by the Nazi occupation of Poland in World War II. And yet you, Poland, you, the Polish people, are controlled by the Germans today. You need to break through. So I think that now that Britain is out of the EU, yes, Britain will secure a trade deal between itself and the European Union, because it is in the interests of Brussels and London, because there is a lot of economic dependency there between the two. But I think that Britain, certainly encouraged by the Americans, will continue to try and weaken the European Union by focusing in on certain countries that they believe are liabilities for the European Union. Poland is just one example.
It's very interesting, I mean, I remember when I was in Poland the day they entered the European Union, and I told my Polish friends, you will regret this.
2004.
That's right. You will regret this. Because the European Union and its quote-unquote value system doesn't match the values of most Poles, and we're seeing this right now. I mean, the interesting thing now is that lessons to be learned here. I mean, I don't see the European Union actually seriously thinking about reform. I think that the leadership of the EU, these mandarins of the universe, they just believe more integration, and we have these populist movements mushrooming all around Europe because of this intent of more intense integration.
And this word populism was just stuck to them by the EU itself. In fact, these are normal people.
Okay, they will not, I want our viewers to know, we will use words the way we want to use them and how we understand them, okay? Yeah. Populism is not a dirty word.
It's not a dirty word, yeah, but for example, when Poland or Hungary, when they disagree with the EU and when Hungary wants to have good relations with Russia, that's not populism. That's rational behavior.
It's called common sense.
Common sense, exactly. And with Poland, I quite agree with what Marcus has just said. But it's interesting, you know, so Britain is going to use Polish nationalism. Well, why is Polish nationalism so strong and important now? Because of the EU. For a very simple reason. The EU is an ideological, basically it's an ideological group of countries, believing in neoliberalism, believing in ultraliberalism, everything that goes with it. So ultraliberalism is very surprising in one way. On the one hand, you know, globalization, migration, they support it all, you know, let's break all the borders. But when they have a conflict with Russia or with China or with Iran, and they will have conflict with big countries because they want to dominate the world, that ideology of neoliberalism wants to dominate the world. Suddenly, they make alliances with the most primitive nationalists. And Poland was one of the cases. The European Union and the United States supported Polish nationalists against Russia.
What about Ukrainian nationalists?
They continue doing it now. You know, the same with Ukrainian nationalism. All of that narrative, which angers so many Russians, that the Soviet Union, together with Nazi Germany, started the World War II. Okay, that was a big...
That's right. We have to end here. We're going to go to a short break. But there's good nationalism and bad nationalism, apparently.
And now this nationalism is turning against the EU.
I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break. Marcus Papadopoulos in London, thank you very much. We're going to go to a break now, and after that break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. And now to Athens. We're joined by Alex Christoforou. He is a director and writer for theduran.com. All right, Alex, thank you for joining us today. I mean, I have this wonderful pleasure of trashing Mike Pompeo and NPR in the same segment. These are gifts that just come to me. We had this squabble with Mike Pompeo. It's not been recorded. This is something that was rendered later through memory. But the NPR reporter was asking Mike Pompeo about Ukraine, and he comes back, and I won't use all the expletives. There was a lot of F-bombs. Do you think Americans care about Ukraine? That's a very interesting question, because Ukraine came out of thin air. It came out of thin air during this impeachment saga that is thankfully almost completely over. But nobody talks about what the U.S. and the European Union did in Ukraine in 2014, the illegal overthrow of an elected president. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, Ukraine, Peter, is just been getting used by Adam Schiff. It's been getting used by Pelosi. It's been getting used by the Republicans as well. And Pompeo really just spells it out for NPR and for Ukraine. And he was in Kiev. And I really hope that Zelensky took note of what Pompeo told Mary Louise Kelly at NPR. Do you think Americans care about Ukraine? And so Pompeo goes to Ukraine. Zelensky was hoping for an invitation to D.C., to the White House, to meet with Trump. He didn't get any of it. Instead, Peter, what we got was the same old, you're fighting for freedom and democracy and blah, blah, blah. The same stuff, actually, that Schiff was saying during the Senate trials when he was giving his speech, that the U.S. needs to stand up for Ukraine because they're fighting for freedom and democracy, and, they're fighting the war against Russia so that Russia doesn't invade the U.S., and all this ridiculous stuff. The honest truth is that the Trump White House does not care about Ukraine, because the Trump White House is transactional. It's looking to make deals, whether it's going to sell weapons, whether it's going to sell oil and natural gas. Pompeo went to Minsk, Belarus, this weekend. For what reason? So that he can sell natural gas to Belarus. That's what they care about. The Trump White House is transactional. Ukraine is getting used here. It's getting used for a coup against the United States president. Obama used it for geopolitical reasons and as a puzzle to this Biden, Lagarde, IMF money laundering scheme. 45 billion went into Ukraine, Peter, from the EU, US, IMF. Where's that money?
The money?
Hunter Biden.
Well, Hunter got
Biden
a little
just
bit.
got a sliver of it. Exactly.
Let me go to Dima. That's right. Where did the money go?
Yeah.
Dima, I mean, from the Ukrainians' perspective, America is their new ally. But from Washington's perspective, Ukraine is a new client state. That's the rub. That is the difference here. Go ahead.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's just hilarious, because we can only guess how strongly worded Pompeo's statement about Ukraine was, because as Washington Examiner writes, F-bombs were flying around when Pompeo told this woman from NPR, Mary Louise Kelly, do you think Americans really care about Ukraine? Of course they don't, is the answer from the Washington Examiner. But Ukraine
and from
is
Mike Pompeo.
important. Exactly. Ukraine is important as a pawn against Russia. So let me remind you of another phrase from Nancy Pelosi, who hates Pompeo and Trump so much. But Nancy Pelosi, nevertheless, 1 year ago, she said, Russia, it's about Russia. It's not about Ukraine. It's about Russia invading eastern Ukraine. All roads lead to Putin. Understand that. Well, everyone understands that all roads basically lead to the people who made the coup in Ukraine. And
the carpetbaggers that followed.
Exactly, and the carpetbaggers that followed. And it is especially hilarious, the article by U.S. former ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, in the New York Times, where he writes, if we believe Washington Examiner, that a Russian triumph in Ukraine will have lasting, earth-shattering effects on the health of other Western democracies. If Ukraine falls, the civilized world falls with it. End of quote.
What does fall mean?
Well,
what is the definition of fall in this case?
Let me remind you, what is Ukraine in the mind of William Taylor and Obama and others? It was Poroshenko. So Poroshenko has fallen. That crook is out of office. Did the civilized world fall with it? The civilized world is feeling itself better. One more crook is out of office.
Well, they were looking for Yanukovych's billions, but they're not looking for Poroshenko's, I suppose.
Well, they found them. Let me remind you that all of this Monsanto story in Latin America, they didn't find Putin's billions, but they found the money of Poroshenko. But somehow Poroshenko stayed in power. And they never found Yanukovych's billions. Let me remind you that the EU court basically apologized to Yanukovych, saying that
and his
we
family.
didn't find that
money. Let me go back to Alex here. But the real Ukraine story is Hunter Biden. And, it is verboten to talk about it. Okay, all right, there's some folks over at Fox News that talks about it. But, I mean, if you go to, MSNBC, CNN, NPR, that is a story that just doesn't seem to get any kind of traction here. But that is the real story here. And Hunter Biden is just a small example of how Ukraine was essentially used as a money clearing operation. And nobody in power seems to really want to be looking at it. I guess Lindsey Graham wants to take it into his committee, but I mean, everybody wants to keep it under wraps. But actually, it's just an excellent example of just how Ukraine has just been this conduit for creating instability against Russia and actually enhancing and allowing more corruption to happen, because there's a high correlation with foreign aid and corruption, highly correlated, and that's for geopolitical reasons. Go ahead, Alex.
That is the moral of the story, Peter. You said it perfectly well. The foreign aid followed by the corruption. The story of Ukraine is Obama's story. It's the Obama coup in Ukraine. It's our guy Yats. It's the other F-bomb that Victoria Nuland dropped, remember? It's Natalie Jaresko, an American citizen serving as the finance minister. We also heard about Vindman being offered the defense ministry position 3 times. These are Americans being offered minister positions in the Ukraine. For what reason, Peter? For what reason? Because all this money was coming in from U.S. taxpayers, EU taxpayers, and the IMF, which was under Lagarde's watch, and she broke many rules by loaning money to Ukraine. She was loaning money to Ukraine, Peter.
What about Greece? What about Greece?
That's what I was just about to say. Greece, Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, all undergoing austerity while they were pouring money into Ukraine. Our money, taxpayer money. This is corruption that far surpasses Hunter Biden. As we said in the earlier segment, Hunter Biden was just a sliver of the corruption that went on in Ukraine.
You know, but all along, Ukraine exists in a vacuum. It's an idea. It's not a place. It's not a large population of people. But we have this new president, Zelensky, ran on anti-corruption, ran on having better ties with Moscow.
Yeah, ending the war, basically.
And ending the conflict in the East. But if you look at the great protectors of Ukraine in Western media and in the political class, they want conflict. This is something and Zelensky is trying to cool things down. And he's trying to find a way out. I think he actually wants to find a way out, but he has to save face. But he doesn't have a partner in his allies, the Americans and the European Union. Go ahead, Dima.
Well, it's true, but unfortunately, it looks like Zelensky doesn't have the guts to really oppose the Ukrainian nationalists who have a free hand in Ukraine. So, judging by his latest statements, he doesn't have the guts to end the war. But I think it was very important what Alex has just said about Lukashenko, about Pompeo coming now to Belarus and trying to talk Lukashenko into buying American gas. You know, the last dictator of Europe buying American gas, that's nice. But if I were Lukashenko's advisor, I would quote to him Trump's letter to Erdogan, the other last dictator of Eurasia. Don't be an idiot and stop doing that. Because Lukashenko, last year, he invited, okay, you want Western advisors. He invited people from the Atlantic Council to consult him on his policy towards Russia. There were Ben Hodges, there were Alexander Veshbo, Michael Carpenter. Now he invited Pompeo to give him advice. Well, my word to Lukashenko would be, if you really want to go down the tubes, listen to the advice of Pompeo.
I want to make sure everybody knows Lukashenko does this every couple of years. He's trying to play one side off against the other.
This time it was really
it never really works. It's really theatrical here. Let me go back to Athens. You know, Alex, you know, where does it go from here? Because, you know, Zelensky's, you know, he's basically between a rock and a hard place. And his great benefactors that he sees in Washington, they're not coming through. The European Union has already told, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, they told the Ukrainians, get your energy relations with Russia fixed because we can't fix it for you, okay? I mean, basically coming down to earth. Now, with the impeachment saga almost completely at an end, maybe there's a possibility to move the needle somewhere. But this whole process has actually damaged Ukraine and the prospects for their own people. They voted for Zelensky overwhelmingly for a better future. That future isn't coming about, and the U.S. and Mike Pompeo could care less. Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. Ukraine needs to look after its own self-interest, and it needs to mend fences with its neighbors, first and foremost being Russia. The EU has abandoned Ukraine. They have no time for Ukraine, especially after Brexit. But Zelensky and the people of Ukraine can learn from Brexit. The UK is now open for business. It needs to start making trade deals with the whole entire world. Ukraine needs to follow that type of line. It needs to start thinking beyond NATO, beyond the EU, beyond the United States, because the entire coup from 2014 was a failed project. It was a failed Obama project. And if I can just say one more thing about Ukraine and the way they're using it, Peter, let's go back to the Don Lemon CNN soundbite that we heard, where they said Trump couldn't find Ukraine if he had a U and a crane. Where they were not only insulting the people that support and vote for Trump, they were insulting Ukraine. They don't care about Ukraine whatsoever. It's, as you said, Peter, Ukraine is not a country. It's not a people. It's this thing that they use to hit Trump over the head with.
Dima, last 30 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like Zelensky doesn't understand it, because last week what he said was, Britain is leaving the EU, so there is a blank spot left, and Ukraine could fill it. Well, if you want to go down the tubes, the same words as to Lukashenko, do it, you know. Well, first, no one will admit Ukraine to the EU, and second, it's a wrong strategy. The EU should mend ties with Russia. This is the real market. This is the real lifeline for Ukraine. Unfortunately, it's not yet doing it now. It relies on the people who, as Michael Pompeo rightly said at NPR, to NPR host, doesn't care about Ukraine.
Doesn't care about. All right, gentlemen, that's all the time we have here. Many thanks to my guests here in Moscow, Athens, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.